Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night. Welcome to Social Value Matters 2020, our first ever online global conference. This year, Social Value International have been thrilled to work with Social Value Canada to bring you this incredible conference over 5 days. We hope that you've enjoyed both the Leadership Summits and the Practitioner Summits and have found them all interesting so far. Please note that the session today has been pre-recorded by the fantastic speakers that we have. You can enjoy watching this session, and below on the screen further down, there is a question box where you can ask questions. Please note that due to time differences, speakers will not always be able to answer your questions straight away, but please do check back because they will get back to you as soon as possible. Now, without further ado, we'll start today's session. I do hope you enjoyed the session and hope to see you soon at another one of our sessions. Thank you.
Good morning. This is Kate McAlpine. I am a researcher and strategist working in the domain of child protection in East Africa. I wear lots of other hats, but that's the hat I'm wearing for the purposes of today. And I'm going to talk to you about valuing the wisdom of crowds. So I'm going to describe the work that I'm doing with Citizens for Change, and then explore some of the dilemmas that we are facing in putting the social value standards into practice in an SROI study. So hopefully the tech works. Hopefully I can follow my own PowerPoint, and I hope that this is of interest. So Citizens for Change is, and let me see if I can get the slides to work. Does it work like that? Oh. No, hold on. Okay, we have the tech here. Okay, so Citizens for Change is actually a community interest company registered in the UK. But I have been working in Tanzania for the last 25 years in the domain of child protection. My PhD explored the worldviews of Tanzanians who take action to protect kids, and generated a theory to enable more people to better protect children from violence. Citizens for Change is really the institutional form of that theory. We are an experiment that hypothesizes that there are thousands of people trying to do the right thing by children, but that they work in silos, face quite a lot of social stigma. And because action agenda tends to be driven by a specialized effort towards child protection systems, the actions of citizens are typically ignored. And in being ignored, it's almost like they don't exist. So Citizens for Change is an effort to resolve the collective action problem that is violence against women and children, and to do so by identifying and mobilizing these civic protectors, building their toolbox so that they can protect kids better, and using data analytics to demonstrate the growing groundswell of protectors and the protective actions that they take. And in doing so, demonstrate to government, investors, planners, that community-driven child protection should receive an equivalent attention and investment to that has typically been done with regards to sort of centralized social welfare-driven approaches to child protection. So we're very experimental, and really social return on investment is one of those experimental angles that we are taking. And what we're trying to demonstrate is that there is a social return driven by citizen child protectors. So I'm going to give you a little context about violence against children and the context in which we're working. Then I'm going to talk about the innovations that we're making more broadly. And then the final part of the presentation will really look at the social value standards and some of the dilemmas that we are trying to grapple with at the moment. So these are some of our citizen protectors. What we're trying to do very much is to counter a sort of deficit-based narrative that is so often typical of discussions around Africa, with a more positive and I would say more accurate representation of citizens who are doing the right thing, really countering pessimism with optimism and evidencing that this optimism is well-founded. So it's important to do that, because really violence against children in the context of East Africa, the statistics are a little shocking. And it would be and is often the route around sort of development practitioners to sort of say the woe is me story, and oh my gosh, these statistics are so horrifying. Well, they are. So we know that violence is prevalent. And not only does violence have a human cost, but it has a societal cost in Africa, because more than 50% of East Africans are children. And in the National Violence Against Children studies, we're seeing very, very high rates, particularly around violence, around physical violence, which is pretty normalized. A lot of child rearing is punitive. So 64% of children reporting experiencing physical violence, 22% sexual violence, and 26% experiencing emotional violence. Violence in any setting, of course, it breaks one's heart, but when one hones back and looks at a societal level, the sheer numbers of children who are victims of violence in the region are pretty horrifying. So, 73.5 million children claiming that they've experienced physical violence. That's a lot of kids. And it, vastly exceeds the rates more globally, where 25% of adults report having been physically abused, and 20% of women report being sexually abused as a child. So we know that violence is prevalent. It's prevalent across the region. And we also know that violence is costly. Violence and maltreatment actually is estimated to cost the world $7 trillion a year. That's a huge economic impact. And of course, the cost starts with the individual child, because it impairs both their physical safety, but also the emotional impairments last a lifetime. The more we know about the impacts of violence on a child's developing brain, the more the case can be made and should be made that other investments, particularly in health and education, are being undermined by a lack of attention on violence against children. In Tanzania, 20% of the budget is spent on education. And over the last 20 years, there has been a constant refrain: why have these educational investments not equated with improved educational outcomes? Well, when you set that aside alongside children's daily experience of violence and the fear of being victims of violence, and you know the impacts of toxic stress on a developing brain, it starts to shed some light on why the educational investments are not having a similar positive outcome as one would anticipate. Now, there's been some studies in the UK, the US, Australia, looking at the lifetime cost to an individual child from non-fatal maltreatment. And it ranges from sort of $72,000 through to sort of a $222,000. So it's hard to pinpoint an actual specific figure, but I think that the message is that the lifetime cost to a child is high. We don't have estimates at that level for East Africa, but the estimates in Tanzania that were used in our own national plan to address violence estimate that 7% of GDP is lost each year to violence against children. And in Kenya, they've done a study looking at the costs of domestic violence towards women, and they estimate that 1% of GDP each year is being spent addressing the consequences of domestic violence. So we know that violence is costly. Now, we also know that counter to this narrative, and it's a narrative based in data, that violence is extensive. We also know that citizens are taking action to protect children. And this was really the context of my lifetime work in the region, has been working at a civic level with individuals who protect kids. Now, what my PhD study revealed is that they do so in response really to what we call the ujasiri mindset. Ujasiri means bravery or confidence in Swahili. And it was a mindset that is informed, it starts in empathy, and it is informed by a really strong moral values drive to do the right thing. So citizens who are taking action to protect kids are many. That's our hypothesis. But we do know that they are atypical. They're atypical because the social norm is largely punitive in the context of bringing up children. And they possess this ujasiri mindset. Ujasiri has sort of three clear dimensions. The first is a belief that children are blameless. They're often called angels. The second is a hope that in helping a child, the child will pay forward that help. And the third is a moral responsibility to do the right thing, to be responsible. Now, ujasiri is really felt at a heartfelt level by compassion. When you talk to protectors and you ask them about their motivation, the word that comes up so much is, when I see a child suffer, it pains my spirit. And it is that pain that really catalyzes action. What is clear is that possession of ujasiri is a precondition for taking protective action. And Citizens for Change is really targeting these specific individuals who are already primed to protect in our attempt to build a crowd of child protectors across the region. Now, what we also know is that over the last couple of decades, where child protection has increasingly come onto the radar in East Africa, there are three types of problems that really inhibit us from addressing violence against children and women. The first is how to achieve high levels of cooperation amongst non-cooperative actors. So although there's a broad consensus about the desired ends, namely children grow up in safe societies, there is a high level of divergence amongst policymakers, politicians, civil society, faith-based actors, educationalists, about how that end should be achieved and even what constitutes safety. So there are many people who may have a professional mandate to protect children, but who at the same time feel that a punitive approach to child rearing is actually necessary for children to grow up into responsible, productive citizens. So there's a lot of non-cooperation in spite of the claimed shared end that we all want to address violence against children. So that's a really big challenge. The second big challenge is really a coordination problem. Is who is ultimately accountable for responding to incidences of violence against children? Now, we have what could maybe be called latent child protection systems. So at the level of the police or the social welfare department or at teachers or local leaders, there is no real clear accountability and certainly no consequences for failing to respond to a report of violence against a child. And there are very few opportunities for children to gain redress in the case of having been abused from the state system. So what that tends to mean in practice is that cases of violence against children will usually be resolved informally between families and the abuser, or the child will not mention it, or the whole case will sort of be brushed under the carpet. there's very little clarity about who is ultimately responsible for dealing with cases, which means that the individuals who are taking action to protect children do so very much in a civic, informal, compassionate sort of mode, rather than referring cases to the authorities. But it also means that the state is fundamentally not having to invest in child protection services. So the whole child protection ecosystem is, at the moment, really doesn't cost the state. It's not providing services. And there's almost a vested interest in it not costing the state. So when we start to look at how does one put a value on the efforts of child protectors, as citizen child protectors, it's not so simple as saying, if they weren't doing it, it would cost the state X, Y, Z, because there's no evidence that the state would actually put X, Y, Z services into place. And then the final sort of problem that we have is that there's evidence that people possess ujasiri and that they do take action to keep children safe. But there's a real evidential gap in the mechanisms that sort of connect people's motivation and their action. And what are they actually doing to navigate the action scene when they are faced with a child who is a victim of violence? You know, what are they actually doing between the moment when they sense a child is at risk and there is some sort of resolution? That is really a large gap in knowledge. And without filling that gap, it becomes very hard to hypothesize how one could transform what is essentially individuals' personal, normative, moral sort of world into something that would be a broader social norm around protecting children. So there's lots of unknowns. It's not a simple ecosystem to work in, and this is really where we think that Citizens for Change could be a useful contribution. So we know that citizens are protecting kids, but we don't know what are the types of social value that these citizens are creating, for whom, and how long does it endure. And the absence of that really makes it very challenging to make the case to the Ministry of Finance or to local government authorities to invest in community-driven child protection. And as such, then, it's sort of everybody sort of operates in a sort of improvisational void. And I think really this is where Citizens Change comes in as filling a specific niche. So we sort of speak to two audiences. We speak to individual citizens who are taking action to protect kids. And then we speak to development agencies who are trying to amplify their impact in the domain of child protection. And our innovation lies in catalyzing, tapping into, and learning from the collective intelligence of this crowd of child protectors. And rather than sort of the typical research modality, which would be one of contracting consultants to do more studies, we're trying to really take a decolonized approach to child protection and learn from these child protectors' instinct to do the right thing. So we are building a crowd of protectors, either by signing up protectors ourselves or working with development agencies who have constituents and of protectors and bringing them into the community. We are then using an SMS platform to survey and to enable protectors to talk to us. And then we're using data analytics to say, what do all these individual survey responses that we are getting mean in the aggregate? And in doing so, we are hoping to demonstrate that protectors are protecting upwards of 136,000 children by the end of 2023. So we're in the pilot stage at the moment. We are hoping by the end of 2023 to have got proof of concept. And proof of concept will look will really take three forms. The first will be that there is a crowd of child protectors across the region, and we are really building a crowd with three elements: a big crowd, a diverse crowd, and a decentralized crowd. But the aim being that they are all motivated by ujasiri. So we are not building a crowd of protectors where we say we are trying to convert individuals who say it's none of our business into protectors. That's not our primary aim. Our primary aim is already to target people who are predisposed and intrinsically motivated to protect kids from harm. The second innovation is to tap into their wisdom so that they can resolve the dilemmas that they face and protect children better. And we do that in two ways. So we have developed a tech platform that enables us to send SMS surveys to protectors. And these SMS surveys take two forms. One is a sort of survey-based, us soliciting their views on how many kids they protected, how the obstacles that they faced, who helps them, how. We can really survey them about anything, but those are the routine surveys that we send every month to really start to understand what the mechanics are of these protective actions. The second set of surveys are, if you will, more public education surveys. So depending on their interests, they can sign up and get a set of educational messages that would inform them about street-connected children, or early childhood development, or community-based child protection, or safeguarding. And at the same time, our partners, our development agency partners, can use that to popularize their own child protection agendas. So for example, at the moment, we are partnering with an archdiocese, and they are using the service to popularize their child protection policy throughout Catholic schools in the region. So the aim of that is that child protectors start to feel that they are experiencing some form of personal development. They're able to escalate their knowledge and their perspective taking. The second element that we do is we run what we call community meetups. In the time of COVID, those are being run virtually. But if life got back together, those are essentially meetups of protectors under the tree, where they start to discuss and resolve the dilemmas they face together. And in that, we're hoping that they experience increased solidarity. And this addresses one of the issues that really comes up for protectors, is that they feel isolated, and oftentimes feel that they're experiencing social stigma by even intervening when their child is suffering. Many protectors come up against that. You know, what are you doing? Stop being nosy. This is none of your business. So the aim is to build both their toolkit in terms of knowledge and skills, but also their sort of social connections and solidarity with others. Now, the final piece of the thing is can we use data analytics or data science for social impact? And so taking all the responses from those surveys and saying, what does it actually mean? And can we use that data to inform the discussions and the decisions that are made by government and policymakers and funders? So this is where the social return on investment work that we're doing comes in. Can we then demonstrate at in the language that resonates with government and funders, the social value that is being generated by the crowd of protectors? So that's what Citizens for Change is trying to do. We are pilot stage at the moment, so we have our strategy, we have our theory of change, and we are about to embark on a forecast social return on investment study. So part of what I am grappling with in this presentation is, I suppose, how granular does one's forecast need to be? The theory of change at the moment is that we intervene by building the crowd of protectors. We develop and deploy the SMS platform. We build an evidence base about the beliefs and actions of protectors and quantify that social value to demonstrate what works in preventing and responding to violence. And the underlying assumptions are really sort of business assumptions for us, that tech can be used for good and that we can develop it, that a crowd of child protectors can be created because there's enough latent demand for that we can tap into the wisdom of the crowd so that protectors will engage with the system, and that the wisdom that we generate can influence others. And then our desired outcomes at an impact level are that young people are protected and that we start to see some transmission of protective norms. Now, at the moment, we've sort of done a tentative, this would create $5 billion of social value, but really a big question mark would go there, because that's the great unknown, is once you've proven that your assumptions are valid, what is the social value being created once children grow up in safe and inclusive society? So that's the theory of change. The aim is that, by the end of 2026, we were able to impact on 500,000 children. The big question, though, is a process question or a mechanics question. How do protective norms spread? How does one tip those personal moral drives into something that is a more widespread social norm? And in doing so, what is the sort of the equivalent monetary value of the social value being created? So that's the question. So really what we are trying to grapple with, and I think we're experimental on a number of levels. We're experimental in that, can we build a tech platform that is fundamentally an analog, old style platform, not using data, but has the same reach and scale that data has? That's the SMS question. We're experimental in the, can we influence the sort of ecosystem in which civic actors are protecting kids? And we're experimental in, can we actually experiment with some of these monitoring and evaluation techniques? So that's what I'm going to be talking about really for the rest of the call. So how can we measure? Now, these are the KPIs, if you will, for us. So we measure the performance of the tech, and we look at that very, very simply at the failure rate or the SMS delivery, and trying to nudge people towards a preference for email rather than SMS, because that has a cost implication for us. We are measured on the size of the crowd. Can we build that crowd from nearly 13,000 to 104,000? We're measuring the engagement. People are self-selecting as a protector, so we have quite high aspirations for engagement, but are those accurate? We're really closely tracking that. A KPI is the number of partners and the reach that they bring, and of course, the number of children protected. Our revenue, can we make this work financially? And are some of our design assumptions accurate? But the one element that I want to focus on today is, what is the return on the social investment? Because I think what we're really seeing from an advocacy perspective in the region for so many of us who work in child protection or care reform is that it's really hard to make a case to government about investing in child protection when they don't see themselves picking up the costs of violence against children, because they fundamentally don't provide the services in the first place. So I think there's a real pressing need that many of us face to be able to put a dollar value to the energy and work that is already being undertaken by citizen protectors. So these are our KPIs. And what I want to talk about for the rest of the presentation is really, how do you then apply the standards in an SROI forecast? So we are really at the design stage of our forecast at the moment. It's moving up the list of our priorities. But as we think through even how to undertake it, and how to adhere to the standards. We're grappling with some questions. So it would have been lovely to have done an interactive session, because I would have liked to have picked your brains on how to answer some of these questions. I have my contacts at the end of the presentation. I would really appreciate it if you have insights or wisdom to share. Please do get in touch, because we certainly don't have the answers at this point. But let's move on. So the involved stakeholders. We're involving 5 sets of stakeholders at this point. So the citizens who take protective action, people who say it's none of my business when they see a woman or child suffer. Now, that's actually quite a hard group to target, because nobody is standing up waving a flag saying, I'm the person who ignores a suffering child. So we access these individuals via our citizen protectors. And then children and women who have experienced protection is the third group. Then our public servants and frontline professionals, so teachers, social welfare officers, police, and community groups. And in Tanzania, we have a national plan of action to address violence against children. And what the form that takes at a community level is voluntary groups. They're called the MPA-VAC committees. So they would be voluntary village-based child protection groups. So those are our stakeholders. They all have, what unites them is they have lived experience of violence. So we have a big question here around the ethical side of when you are looking at violence, either as a protector or as somebody who turns their back on a situation, or as somebody who has experienced protection and therefore has experienced violence. And in a context where violence is so prevalent, how does one frame any sort of research or consultation or dialogue in a way that doesn't open cans of worms for people, doesn't cause secondary trauma, and particularly doesn't do so when the therapeutic services available to people are extremely limited. I mean, almost impossible to access. So this involving stakeholders question is ethically fraught, because the framing of the questions all the time has to be as therapeutic as possible. The last thing that one wants is to go into a situation to ask people to relive trauma for us to undertake for us. And so a lot of the involvement conversations for us are around the ethics, which then raises the question for me at this moment. This is a SROI forecast. Therefore, how critical is it to involve stakeholders at this point? Or can one say it is legitimate just to do a thought experiment based on the impacts that we want to see and based on our theory of change? That's question number one. And I think in answering that question, maybe the other standards start to fall into place a bit more. But I don't have any real clarity on that first question. The second question then is, assuming that one does have to involve stakeholders, and to do so with high levels of ethical consideration and in a way that enables stakeholders to contribute in a authentic and substantive way to the study. How to achieve that in a COVID world where face-to-face engagement is constrained, and with people who live on the digital margins. So thankfully, really our SMS tech platform positions us at least to be able to answer that question. And we do that via these survey questions, really. What have you done to protect children? This is actually a routine question we ask everybody. What change did they experience? And I should have probably underlined they, because as you'll see when I talk about further down the presentation around who matters, or what matters, and what is material, I think the question is change amongst whom? Then what were the outcomes for the children, but also for the children's families and for the communities in which we live? You know, violence happens within an ecosystem. And so one needs to look at change at different dimensions. How long does that change endure? And then the attribution question, how much of it was due to the individual's protective action? So we can theoretically ask those questions on the SMS platform. That's obviously a potential limitation, though, that these are pretty hefty questions that are often best answered in dialogue. And the nature of an SMS survey is that it goes to an individual. So how valid, how reliable, how nuanced are the results that we're going to get if we're using an SMS survey to elicit these responses rather than a dialogic experience? So I think this standard poses quite a lot of questions for us in of itself. And as I talk this through, I'm a little bit like, oh my God, you know, this is a biggie. It's not just a desk exercise. So the second standard is then understanding what changes. Again, this is a newbie to social return on investment studies, and maybe a more experienced practitioner would answer this in a second. We're very clear what our desired impacts are. Children and young people are protected, protective norms spread, improved tracking of progress in achieving the National Plan of Action, and investment in community child protection. Those are the impacts we want to achieve. So in an SORI forecast, are the changes that you want to explore the changes that are in your theory of change, or something more granular? Now, are we asking then, what has changed as a result of protectors taking action to protect a child? And are we asking stakeholders what has changed as a result of their engagement with Citizens for Change? That in of itself is a bit of a dilemma. My instinct is that the purpose of the exercise is to understand the social value being created by citizen protectors, and therefore we ask them what has changed as a result of them taking action to protect a child. Now, as you can see, when we looked at the stakeholders, we said that one of the groups of stakeholders that we are talking to are people who would typically say it's none of my business when they see a woman or child suffer. And the intent is also to look not just at positive change, but at unintended or potentially negative change. So in even framing these questions, I think that there probably is a question 3 that we need to ask is, what has changed as a result of you not taking action to protect a child? Now I come back to the SORI as a forecast rather than as an evaluation. How far down the rabbit hole do we want to go? Is that question number 3, what has not changed, or what has changed as a result of you not protecting a child, appropriate to ask in a forecast at this early stage of our process? So every standard raises its set of questions. Standard number 3 is, what are the things that matter? So this standard about materiality, but whose perspective on what matters takes primacy? So it is all about perspective taking. So government, parents, public servants, community members, all potentially value a child's well-being differently to each other, and probably more saliently to how the child values their well-being. Now let's overlay onto that the fact that what matters is both contextual and that childhood itself is a cultural construct. That makes that question of what are the things that matter layered and complex. And I suppose harkens back to the scope of the engagement and which stakeholders one involves. Are we looking at an understanding of the value that child protectors create from the perspective of child protectors, from the perspective of the children who were protected, from the perspective of the public servants much of whose mandated work is being done by citizens rather than themselves? I think this really starts to then elicit the importance of really narrowing down the purpose of the study to something as precise as possible, because this question of what matters becomes complex. I think it also starts to question that issue that I brought up early on in the presentation about the costs of child maltreatment. Those have largely been calculated in the North, but in the global South, do those calculations from other jurisdictions, are they valid? Are they universal? You know, the very premise of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child was that child rights were universal. Every child has the same rights. Does that therefore mean that when a child's rights are violated, as they are when they are harmed, is the cost commensurate? These are almost sort of ontological questions that need to be confronted when you're doing a study. So I think that you know, the technocrat brain is very attracted to an SORI because it starts to put a language and a specificity to stuff that is often very amorphous and very led by feelings and emotion. But actually, when you start to dig into this, you realize that, you know, this question of what matters, what is valuable, and how does one put a price on something as valuable as a child's life and a child's right to live in safety, becomes complex on a whole different set of philosophical levels. So you have the philosophical question, but then you also have the subject-object question. So children are the subjects of protective action. But does their perspective of what matters to them override that of the adults who actually take the protective action? And if that really is the case, if we conclude that that is the case, do we actually need to revisit our stakeholders and focus on asking children about the types and value of change that they have experienced, and actually sideline the perspectives of the adults more? And if one decides to do that, what are both the ethical implications of that? But that also requires a whole different set of methodological approaches in your consultation around doing research with children. And so, as you can see, as I've worked myself into this presentation, I think, you know, layers upon layers of complexity that you need to work through, even before you get to the point of articulating the types of changes that are being achieved. So then you have this question of only include what is material. So I'm going to give an example from another SORI study that I'm doing at the moment for a youth movement in Tanzania. So this is a SRI study with Femina HIP, and Femina HIP have a brilliant 20-year program of work where fundamentally they do two things. They produce magazines, social media material, radio shows, television shows that are essentially about edutainment. So a really accessible way for young people to learn about sexual and reproductive health, entrepreneurship, self-awareness, and issues that matter in our world. So climate change, civic behavior, and so on. So they have these edutainment materials, and then they have a system of school clubs that are run by teachers who then become a mentor. So those teachers then participate in training and then set up a school club that the students participate in, and they use the club forum to discuss and dialogue around the edutainment materials that they're receiving. So the study that I am doing for them has taken stories of significant change that they have elicited from the teacher mentors and the student clubbers over the last 4 years. And we have examined these stories to look for the types of changes that are being surfaced. And 13 changes have come out. So 13 well-defined outcomes. So we have outcome 1, students are informed about self and society. Students know that they have rights, students become self-disciplined, students become confident and able to express themselves, and then they become able to see and take advantages of opportunities. They then earn money, which they use to purchase products that enable continued attendance at school. As a result, truancy decreases, students stop using marijuana, smoking cigarettes, and/or drinking. Academic performance improves. Students delay and/or have safe sex. They become active citizens, and they pursue redress when they're threatened. Now, when you look at this sequence of which came from this, they say only include what is material. So outcomes 6 through to 13 are really contingent on students having gone through and experienced outcomes 1 through to 5, or 1 through to 4 at least, probably 1 through to 4. Does that mean then, when one starts to explore that question around only include what is material, does that mean that outcomes 1 to 4 are immaterial for the purposes of the study, or that they are material? Again, I have no answers. It's just raising to me the complexity of what seem like very simple standards, that when you start to dig into them, how complex adhering to that standard is, and making the judgment call on where one's position is. So let's now move to the standard about do not overclaim. I think this is maybe less complicated, but probably requires a level of self-discipline that those of us who are schooled in advocacy maybe don't have so much. The temptation, of course, is to overclaim, because the purpose of the study is to advocate. So the purpose is to advocate for an investment in community-driven child protection, and for a decentering of the discourse away from experts and towards citizens. The temptation, of course, is to overclaim the value being created to make one's advocacy case stronger, or at least, on a first run, that would be the temptation. But it's a forecast, it's not an evaluation. And already, although the intent is to say protectors generate X amount of social value, certainly at this point in our story, it's not okay to make any claim of social value being created across the region. And it does just raise this question: how much can you generalize from a specific study? I think in going through and writing the presentation, I really realized that you can't use this study even for advocacy at this point in the story. All you can do is use this study as a thought experiment. And that doesn't mean that policymakers and funders and government may not be interested in it, but one could not use it to make a case for changed planning or investment decisions at a larger level. And I suppose that comes back to the be transparent. You know, this is a learning exercise. It's a thought experiment. It's extremely preliminary. And therefore, it's not really appropriate to use it in any substantive way to inform either our value proposition. I think we still, even doing the forecast, are going to have a big question mark on, you know, how much social value is created by citizen protectors. And likewise, our advocacy, it can be used as a starting point for conversation with government and funders and planners. But I certainly can't make a case at this point for a shift in budgetary attention towards community-based child protection. That doesn't mean it's not exciting or innovative or a huge opportunity. But I think that in doing so, and just even thinking through these standards, you realize that it is a minuscule contribution to the larger agenda that Citizens for Change have. So the final standard is sort of verify the results. And I think I want to conclude on this because in the world of international development, closing the feedback loop is probably one of the biggest problems that I see in research and evaluation. There is such a long-standing and poor practice of researchers coming into communities, coming into community groups and picking people's brains. Please tell us more. Please tell us about your life. Why does this happen? What's the cause of this? What's the consequence of this? How does it feel? But these citizens never see the results of these studies. The feedback loop is never closed, 99% of the time. And the result is really quite a lot of cynicism now about outsiders and researchers. And certainly skepticism that research adds any real value. I mean, even somebody who does, like myself, who does a lot of research for clients, even I don't see the feedback loop being closed between a piece of research that is commissioned and a program that is designed off the back of it. That is rarely even shared with me as the researcher. So citizens whose experiences and views have been elicited are doubly excluded from this. What it tends to do is also objectify stakeholders. You know, these are, so many citizens have become sort of data points. And I think really it makes it very unclear whether the conclusions are valid or reliable, because the conclusions of these studies are never shared with citizens. The result is never verified. So I think that there is definitely an argument that in terms of this standard, we should be doing more. Our plan at this design phase was to use the SMS tech platform to develop a series of SMS surveys that would share the preliminary results and ask the protectors to scrutinize and challenge them. But I'm wondering, beyond this, whether we should be doing more. That feels rather tactical, rather than a genuine attempt to verify the result. And I think that what this speaks to is that I had started this presentation really thinking that the SORI study was a discrete piece of work that one would do annually or biannually. But it seems to me that the SROI is actually an iterative body of work. It's always on the go. One is always doing it, and it needs to be designed as such. I suppose in the way that as one keeps one's financial accounts, you are constantly entering your figures, analyzing your figures, making meaning of your figures, changing your decisions. I think that this needs to be done in the same way with one's social accounts, and to be done in a way, it's a larger ambition, but it's an easier ambition to grapple with, is to work in an agile way with this, because there is so much uncertainty about how it plays out, is to create this into a body of work that one is constantly adapting as one learns, rather than as a set of studies that are commissioned, albeit annually. And so I think that is my takeaway from this, is that capturing the wisdom of the crowd, valuing the wisdom of the crowd, and measuring the wisdom of the crowd is something that one does in the same way as one builds every other element of one's social enterprise. It is done continuously, it's done intentionally, it's done ethically, and it's done adaptively. And with that, I would like to just offer you, if you have the opportunity to download the presentation, there are links through to other questions that we're constantly grappling with here, and to say thank you. I hope that this was useful. Please do get in touch if you have any insights that would help me answer the question that I've posed. Thank you very much.
I hope you enjoyed today's session at Social Value Matters 2020. Once again, if you do have any questions for the speakers on today's session, please do ask the questions below in the box, and the speakers will get back to you as soon as they possibly can. On behalf of everybody at Social Value International and Social Value Canada, I just want to thank all of the speakers for the incredible sessions that they've done today, and all of you for attending. We hope that you find the rest of this week's conference as interesting as you found today, and it will see you soon at another one of the events.